Okay, go ahead and turn over to 1 Kings chapter 19. We are continuing our study of the life and times of Elijah and Elisha. Last week we wrapped up chapter 18. Of course, chapter 18 is probably the most well-known story about Elijah when he has the showdown with the 450 prophets of Baal, and they both call for fire from their God, and the prophets of Baal are unable to do it. Elijah does it, happens immediately. God sends down fire, burns up the entire sacrifice and everything that's around it, and the 450 prophets of Baal are killed. And then Elijah prays, and rain comes back on the ground, and both he and Ahab go down to Jezreel, and we discussed in quite unnecessary detail about how Elijah is probably the fastest marathon runner at the time in probably all of history by being able to outrun Ahab's chariot to Jezreel. And that's where we left off. So we're going to go ahead and just get right into it. So I'm going to read for us 1 Kings chapter 19, verses 1 through 8, please. 1 through 8.
And Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, also how he had executed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah, saying, So let the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time. And when he saw that, he arose and ran for his life, and went to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, and came and sat down under a broom tree. And he prayed that he might die, and said, It is enough. Now, Lord, take my life, for I am no better than my fathers. Then as he lay and slept under a broom tree, suddenly an angel touched him, and said to him, Arise and eat. Then he looked, and there by his head was a cake, baked on coals, and a jar of water. So he ate and drank and lay down again. And the angel of the Lord came back the second time, and touched him and said, Arise and eat, because the journey is too great for you. So he arose and ate and drank, and he went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights, as far as Horeb, the mountain of God.
Okay. So a whole bunch of things happening here, and we're going to have to kind of touch up on our geography a little bit as we go. But this seems to occur pretty closely after the events of 1 Kings chapter 18. And there may be, a few days in between here, but not very long. And we have here at the very beginning Ahab informing Jezebel of what has happened, what's gone on at Mount Carmel. Apparently she was not there. That doesn't surprise me. She was probably in Samaria at the time when these 450 prophets of Baal were killed. Now, of course, Ahab was probably a little distraught that, all these prophets of Baal were killed because they're in his service. But Jezebel is really the one who cares a lot more about this. Remember, Baal is a Sidonian god or deity, and she hails from Sidon. She is the daughter of the king of Sidon. So this is really more an attack on her and her culture, if you will, than anyone else. And so she takes quite personal offense to this. If anyone hates Elijah more than Ahab does, it's Jezebel. And this will come up probably several times as we go along. Now, it's not exactly clear to us, because we don't have super deep information on how this occurred, how word got to Jezebel. Either Ahab had to have traveled further south down to Samaria, because we know he went to Jezreel at the end of chapter 18. If he continued on later to Samaria and then broke the news personally, or if he sent a messenger from Jezreel to Samaria, we're not exactly sure. If I had to choose one, I'd say he probably went to Samaria himself. That's where his palace is. It would make sense for him to go there in the aftermath of all this. But we're not told. But either way, Jezebel is not happy about this. And so she sends a messenger to Elijah telling him, basically, I'm going to make sure you die. I'm going to have you killed by this time tomorrow. There's a lot of interesting things about this is apparently Elijah's location is known so that a messenger is able to get to him, which it brings up a lot of questions. Was he still in Jezreel? Had he gone somewhere else? But, people knew where he was. He wasn't in hiding anymore. We're not clear exactly on that. I imagine he's still somewhere in the area of Israel. We don't see any movement. So I usually assume he's in Jezreel, but we're not for sure certain about that. And it's also interesting, why does she send a messenger? If she wants him dead, don't let him know you're going to kill him. Just send the guys to go kill him. Why not just send the assassins? I don't know exactly why that is. We can make guesses. And maybe she didn't have anybody on hand at the time. The queen does not have the same authority of a king, especially in those times. And maybe she would have had to kind of haggle and use some political capital, if you will, on either her husband or somebody else to get this to happen. And that takes time, and that's bureaucracy for you. You can't get anything done without with all this red tape. But anyway, she sends a messenger and lets him know. And it could even be she's not in any position to actually carry this out. She just wants to scare him. It's possible that that's the case too, but I feel with Elijah's reaction that she probably does have the ability to do this, just given the time. Go ahead, Arnold. You have your hand up.
Yeah, I think she maybe needs time to work on Ahab,
Yeah.
try to set things up. So maybe that's what she's trying to let him know. This is gonna happen.
And when you bring that up, and this we have to remember that Ahab was there on Mount Carmel. He saw what God did. He's probably convinced in his heart, at least a little bit, that, hey, maybe this Baal thing isn't the way to go. And that's going to be the thing that takes time, is not just convincing him to, send somebody to kill Elijah, but convincing him to kill someone who's a prophet of God, who just did something to show that God is the God. He's not limited by anything. In fact, he's more powerful than these 450 prophets of Baal who have been killed. That's perfectly a reasonable explanation, because again, Ahab is going to have all these instances where God is trying to show him the way, and he seems to kind of get it, and then not so much, very quickly. But we don't know the details. These are just assumptions. But for whatever reason, she doesn't just have someone go and kill him right away. She sends a messenger instead. And it almost seems, and kind of, I guess, if you're reading this for the first time and you didn't know what comes up next, it's almost a strange reaction by Elijah. Consider what Elijah has, he himself, done and seen. God has led him through 3.5 years of drought, under threat of death from the state, basically. He's a fugitive, living and hiding the whole time during this drought. But God has provided for him with the ravens and the brook, and then you had the widow from Zarephath, and then you had this showdown on Mount Carmel, and God provided the fire for the sacrifice, and it was this great and powerful thing. And then Elijah prayed, and the rain comes again, and it's a heavy rain. It's not just God kind of saying, yeah. He's really bringing it. He's really showing he's in control, and it makes you wonder, well, why is Elijah scared of this? Of all things, why is he afraid now? And I think we're going to kind of see this answered as we go along in this chapter. I think Elijah's kind of purpose, he feels like it's run out, because he's done all these things, and yet there hasn't really been any meaningful change, and we're not going to see any meaningful change throughout history. This doesn't really do anything except for kill a bunch of prophets of Baal for a time. The people are not convinced in their heart. They don't turn away from these idols. They keep pursuing these idols from here on out. I don't think that's a surprise to anybody who's studied the Israelites. They kept on doing this. And I think Elijah's just kind of had enough. He doesn't know what to do anymore. I don't know I would call it his faith is shaken, but certainly his fears are superseding his faith at the moment, it seems. So he is afraid. He flees for his life. And we get an interesting description on his journey here. He goes to Beersheba, and he leaves his servant there before moving on. Now, this servant, I believe, is the same servant that was mentioned at the end of chapter 18, the one that went to go see, if there's anything coming from the sea, and then go tell Ahab, hey, rain is coming. Just briefly mentioned there. We talked probably ad nauseum about that servant and why he's even mentioned here. Well, now he's gone. This is where he gets off the train here. We don't see him hook up with Elijah further on his journey or anything like that. He doesn't seem to come back. And we know later on in chapter 19, Elisha seems to fill that role. And so he's not needed anymore. Again, we know so little about the servant. It's hard to know what was going through his mind when Elijah goes down to Beersheba and says, okay, you're out of a job, go on your way. I don't know how that encounter, or that, I guess that dismissal went. Again, we don't have details about that. But I want to talk about the location as well here. Beersheba, for those of you, probably a lot of you know this, Beersheba is like the southern border, the southern tip of the southern kingdom of Judah. So he's not in Israel anymore. He's gone south, which if he's in Jezreel means he had to probably go past or around Samaria on his way down, which is the capital. That's where Jezebel would be. That'd be very dangerous. But he had to go south to get to Judah, and then he's gone to the very southern tip of Judah. Beersheba is basically the last city of Judah. When you see, there's a phrase that comes up several times throughout the Old Testament, from Dan to Beersheba. You have Dan way in the far north and Beersheba in the far south. That tends to indicate all of Israel. From Dan to Beersheba, this was heard, or from Dan to Beersheba, this happened. That's including the encompassing of all Israel. It's a phrase you see a lot. So Beersheba was actually mentioned in our Abraham study. I don't know if you all remember when Abimelech and Abraham make their treaty. That place is called Beersheba from that point on. So that's where it gets its name. So fun connections from our previous study. But he goes there, and now he's going to go into the wilderness. He goes a day's journey into the wilderness by himself. South of Beersheba, there's really not much of anything. It's a very desolate place. There's not a lot of civilization there, not much water, not much food. Unless he took food with him, he's not going to really have anything to kind of eat off as he goes. There's not like trees or berries that he could just pick off as he goes. It's not that kind of place. And we don't see any indication that he did bring a lot of provisions with him. But he gets a day's journey in, and he moves on all by himself. And, he gets under this broom tree. He's probably fatigued, I imagine. And he kind of pours himself out to God here. And I've talked about this a little bit leading up to here, is Elijah, so far up to this point, God says something, says, Elijah, go do this. This is what's going to happen. Elijah goes and does it. No questions asked, no complaints, nothing. He just goes and does it. And now we're going to see a very different side of Elijah. Elijah here is just kind of pouring out his feelings to God and saying, take my life. There's no reason for me to keep going on, basically. I'm no better than my ancestors. I imagine this was a very emotional outpouring from Elijah, because immediately after he falls asleep, I don't know if he exhausted himself in this outpouring. I kind of get that imagery. We're not told exactly. But this is kind of Elijah at a very, very low moment. Even though he's done all these great things, God has performed these miraculous signs for the people, nothing has changed. Elijah's fleeing for his life, and he's out in the wilderness all by himself, and he says, there's no reason for me to keep going on, God. This is it. Just let me die. It's really sad, but as we're going to see, God is not going to let this be the end for Elijah, but this is where Elijah is mentally in his head. Emotionally, he's done. He doesn't feel like moving on anymore. This is what he sees as the best outcome. But God provides for Elijah here. We have an interesting description of an angel of the Lord who seems to bake some bread for him and provide water for him. This happens a couple times. He eats and drinks, falls asleep again, eats and drinks. And it describes him being strengthened by this food, by these provisions. And, as I said, there's not really going to be any other sustenance. So in my mind, there's got to be some really good calorie intake from this bread, because he travels 40 days from here on out. It doesn't seem like he stopped to take a break or got something from anywhere else. He may be subsisting on just this alone. So he's able to make this journey. He goes 40 days now from this point to Horeb. Now, does anyone know another name that this is usually called, this mountain of God, Horeb? Sinai is another word that's often used for this. And some people will say, well, Horeb refers to the region and Sinai is the actual mountain itself. The Bible kind of uses it interchangeably. I don't have any issues with that. I mean, the Bible makes it clear that that's the same place. If you go to different places in the Bible, it'll go by different names, but always have a very similar description. So I have no issue with the names being interchangeable. As we know, through other studies, you have names that are used for the same place in reference several times. So it's not a mistake or an error. in the scripture. It's just another name that's used for that place. So he comes to the mountain of God here. Now this, of course, is a very significant place. What kind of things happened here at Horeb or Sinai? Anything important? The Ten Commandments, this is where Moses went up to get the Ten Commandments. I believe it's also the place where the burning bush was. Any others? Those are probably the ones we'll think of first, but this is a pretty important mountain. This is not just some random place that Elijah's come to. He's kind of come to almost where it all began, if you will. You know, it was the Israelites came out of Egypt, the Exodus, they came out into the wilderness, and then they came to this mountain, and this is where they received the commandments. This is where Moses revealed the law to them, and you had all sorts of great, powerful descriptions about the terrible just sight of the mountain, because the presence of God was there, and all the things and rules about don't touch the mountain or you're going to die, and all these things. So this is not just a random place. This is a place of great significance. And Elijah, I don't know if this was God guiding him here or this is where he decided to go himself. This is where he is. This is not just some happenstance or chance. There's a reason he's going to be here. Any comments up to that point, up through verse 8? There's probably a lot more we're going to say about the significance of Horeb in a minute, so I'm not going to touch too much more on that quite yet, but let's see if anyone else got any thoughts. Okay, all right, everyone's in agreement. This is going to be easy. We're going to get through this whole chapter. Someone read for us verses 9 through 14, please. 9 through 14. Okay. So Elijah, when he arrives at Horeb, he spends the night in a cave there, and God comes to him and asks him, "Why are you here, Elijah? What are you doing here?" Now, I don't think this is God not knowing what the answer is. I think this is a moment for self-reflection on Elijah's part. So it's not like God has no idea what's going on here. He's asking a question to get Elijah to think about it. Now, Elijah kind of explains the situation to God. Again, I think this is probably an emotional outpouring. The things he says are mostly true. He talks about how he's been very zealous for God. Certainly everything, verse 17 or chapter 17 and 18 supports that. He did the work of the Lord. It talks about how the Israelites, by and large, had rejected God. That was the case, and that seems to be the case moving forward, even after chapter 18's events. He talks about the altars to God have been torn down. We know this is at least true in one instance, because in the showdown on Mount Carmel in chapter 18, before Elijah prepared the sacrifice, he had to rebuild the altar to God there with the 12 stones. That's described in verses 30 through 32, if you want to go back to that. So we do know that's true. The prophets of God were being killed. That's definitely mentioned in 1 Kings chapter 18, verses 4 and 13. Obadiah talks about that. And then he also says that, I'm the only one left. Now, early parts of 1 Kings chapter 18 talk about the 100 prophets that Obadiah hid. So he's not the only one, and Obadiah even talked to Elijah about that. So Elijah knows he's not the only one, even though he may be the only one that's actively defying the royalty at this point. But we also know that God is going to reveal later on in this chapter, he's got 7,000 faithful people who have not bowed down to Baal. Now, those may not be prophets. Those may just be normal Israelites, your run-of-the-mill civilian, if you will. But Elijah's not really alone in this. I think that's kind of his point is all these bad things are happening, and I'm all alone. There's not really any reason for me to keep going. This is kind of a pointless, fruitless endeavor. Let's just give it up. Now, instead of addressing Elijah's complaints immediately here and head on, God kind of does something really interesting with Elijah. He tells him that the presence of the Lord is going to pass by. Now, I want to kind of talk about this a little bit in relation to Moses because, and I've kind of said this before, when there's a parallel with Elijah and Moses, I'm going to bring it up. So I'm going to bring it up. We have a similar instance where the presence of the Lord, you see that kind of wording mentioned, happens in Exodus chapter 33. The story is described in verses 12 through 23. I'm not going to turn there for the sake of time because I do want to kind of finish out this section. But if you go back to that, the Lord, talks to, he's having conversation with Moses, and Moses kind of makes a request of God to know the Lord fully and to understand him fully. And part of that is the presence of God passing by him. But he doesn't let Moses see his face because he says, anyone who sees my face will die. And so he says, I'm going to pass by. You're going to hide behind this rock, and then you can see me after I pass by. You can look at my back, basically, as I pass by, because otherwise you'll die. It'll be too great for you. So there's a really interesting parallel between both of these men are going to experience a very close encounter, very powerful, intimate encounter with God. Now, we have three powerful occurrences that happen here. It seems to be kind of one after the other. We have a mighty wind, followed by an earthquake, followed by a fire. Not really much explanation about where any of these came from or what they did very much. We get a little bit of description, but it's kind of passed over because these are not so important, because what's important is what happens after that. After these three occurrences, Elijah hears a gentle whisper or a gentle voice, depending on how your translation words that. And when Elijah hears this, he approaches the mouth of the cave, and he has a cloak over his face. I imagine if this is a similar reason to why Moses had to be hidden by the rock, if he sees too much of the presence of God, if he'll die, sort of thing. It doesn't describe it in that way, but whatever it is, it's too much for Elijah to see with the naked eye. Just go out and look. He's covering his face with his cloak as he approaches. Now, I'm going to open the biggest can of worms because I want to talk about this. It may not be a can of worms, maybe a huge sidetrack. Let's go to Isaiah chapter 40 real quick. And maybe some of you already know where I'm going with this. Let me read Isaiah chapter 40, verses 1 through 3. Where he says, comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and proclaim to her that her hard service has been completed, that her sin has been paid for, that she has received the Lord's hand double for all her sins. A voice of one calling in the desert, prepare the way for the Lord, make straight in the wilderness a highway for our God. Now, I think this is a really interesting verse, and kind of the way you read it might read differently. Which is why I think we'll have a really good conversation about it. That's why I'm bringing this up. This verse, especially verse 3 here, a voice of one calling in the desert, prepare a way for the Lord, make straight in the wilderness a highway for our God. Now, this verse, I don't know if Isaiah was specifically kind of looking to Elijah's encounter with God, this voice that appears after these great three events that say, theirs are powerful, but God's not in them. Then there's this gentle voice. I don't know if this voice in verse 3 is hearkening back to that story, but if we kind of go full circle here, I almost think he is. Of course, this verse is used quite a bit in the New Testament by John the Baptist. If you go through the Gospels, John the Baptist quotes this, Matthew chapter 3, verse 3, Mark chapter 1, verse 3, Luke chapter 3, verse 4, and John chapter 1, verse 23. He says this to kind of explain the work he's doing. People ask him, who are you? What are you doing? And he says, this is who I am. This is what I'm doing. He refers to Isaiah chapter 40, verse 3, the voice of the Lord that calls in the desert, make way the path of the Lord, make straight the way of the Lord, depending on how your translation words that. I'm kind of paraphrasing just slightly. So that's his explanation for his work. It's hearkening back to Isaiah chapter 40, verse 3, which I'm kind of, for a bit here, maybe supposing that Isaiah chapter 40, verse 3 is also hearkening back to this story in Elijah in 1 Kings chapter 19, talking about this soft voice from God. The reason I think this connection has a bit more strength than, kind of what I've drawn so far is when you look at the prophet Malachi. Malachi foretold that Elijah would be sent to the people before the day of the Lord was come to pass. This is in Malachi chapter 4, verse 5. Interestingly, and maybe it's not interesting to you, I think it's interesting, Jesus himself refers to John the Baptist in this way. He calls him Elijah, refers to him as Elijah. You see this in Matthew chapter 11, verse 14, and Matthew chapter 17, verses 11 through 23, where basically his disciples kind of figure out that he's talking about John the Baptist when he's talking about Elijah, and he doesn't dispute that, so we can assume that's also true. Matthew 11:14 makes that very clear also. And then also the angel Gabriel, when he talks of the birth of John the Baptist, he says that he would have the power and the spirit of Elijah. That's in Luke chapter 1, verse 17. So there's this very strong connection with all this between John the Baptist and the coming of Elijah. He was this Elijah. And it's interesting that John the Baptist uses this particular verse in Isaiah chapter 40, verse 3, to talk about the work that he is doing. So I don't think it's a far stretch to say that Isaiah chapter 40 is referring to this moment in 1 Kings chapter 19 of God's voice calling to Elijah here in the wilderness. This, of course, doesn't really have any direct significance to Elijah himself at this point, but I think this is God, as he very much does, kind of is leaving clues and breadcrumbs for people later to understand this is what the significance and the symbolism of this was. Here is it coming to fruition. So there's my long and huge unnecessary explanation about that, why God did it in this way. I think God is building upon stuff starting way, way, way before Jesus' time, and is trying to connect these dots, between Elijah's work and the work of John the Baptist, and the work that John the Baptist is going to do for the coming of the Christ. So, any comments about that before I move on? Because I just threw a whole bunch of stuff at you there. Okay, Jeff, go ahead. No, I think you're up.
Okay.
Yeah.
The coming of Christ was obviously a happy occasion and something that we see and think of with great joy. But the coming of Christ is occasioned by some work we have to do. And as we come to Christ today, it's a joyous thing to realize that you found the pearl of great price. This is what you're here to do. This is your purpose. But you've got some work to do. You got to repent. You got to change, and it's difficult. And so Jesus' purpose is connected to Elijah because he called the Israelites out, even though they didn't listen. Not all of them anyway. Most of them didn't listen, but some of them did, and some of them heard, and that was great. And so I think that's one of the things. It's interesting as he talked about, as the text talks about the different ways that God displayed forces to Elijah: the wind, the fire,
The earthquake.
I think he's saying here that God doesn't save the way men think he saves. God doesn't work the way men think he works. It's in the still small voice. God can do great things, and he wants us to have evidence that his power is unending and complete. There's no one greater than God. He wants us to understand that. But he really doesn't work in those ways. Even today, he works in that appeal, that sense of persuasion, that desire to say I love you to every person that still doesn't know him. And it's really a powerful thing for us to realize
the way we want them. Yeah.
It's, on the same level that Elijah wanted certain results. And sometimes God works in other ways, and there are reasons for it. And the reason or the understanding is found more in that still small voice than it is in the great thunder and the wind and the fire. And there will be a day for that, in which, all things will end, but now is the still small voice. And our work, in a sense, should be through humility and kindness and love and forgiveness. It's through that still small voice rather than through oratory and charisma and, the things that people respond to very often.
And we see this in Jesus' life. He performs all these miracles, these signs, and the people are amazed. And they're saying, hey, there's something about this guy, but it's what he says that really gets people going. Either they really don't like what he's saying, or they really do like what he's saying. You're going to be in one of two camps. You can't have a middle ground there. There are some people who are just overjoyed and amazed by his teachings. And then, of course, you have the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, who are like, oh no, we don't want this. And so you have, it's not the miracles that saved the people, if you will, or convinced the people. It was the things that he taught, which is very different than, again, a lot of us would probably think. And obviously this sign, this huge showdown in chapter 18 did not convince all of Israel that, hey, it was time to turn aside from Baal and turn back to God. That did not have the effect that it was needed for them to change their minds, I guess. So yeah, we can. That's a whole nother lesson, Jeff. Right? I don't have time to get on all that, but very very good comment. Any other thoughts on any of this that I've said? Go ahead, Arnold.
Yes, I believe this also lets us know that God doesn't need a great fanfare, and he doesn't use all that, what you might expect.
Mhm.
No, it's, most of the time it's something totally different. You just have to pay attention.
And Elijah, at least to his credit, he seemed to recognize that, because he doesn't seem to be swayed or affected by any of these great things that occur before this voice. But as soon as he hears that voice, that's when he approaches. So we can give Elijah a lot of flack here for some of the things he says and does, but he still knows and he still recognizes really what God is about. Just the end of this section that we read, I want to just mention here. Again, God asks him after all this, what are you doing here, Elijah? And he says the exact same thing. He has the exact same answer. I'm the only one. Nothing's changed. He's giving the exact same answer he gave back in verse 10. So there's not really much that has changed in his mind, or at least what he wants to say. But of course, this is not going to dissuade God at all. And I think God's going to give him some purpose here. And this is part of Elijah's problem is he sees that this is fruitless. There's nothing we can do. It's just time to give up. But God is about to give him some instructions and kind of show him that it's not the end. There's still work to do. There's still things to be done. There's still some hope. Go ahead.
One more thing about the things that God did in the mountain. I think it's parallel to the fact that you mentioned Jesus worked miracles and things like that, and God's power can be seen in so many ways today in the universe. But the message of salvation is in the words.
Mm-hmm.
And so what he said was, when the wind came, God was not in the wind. The message of God was not in the wind. God was not in the fire. God was not in the thunder. God was in the still small voice. And that, I think, is parallel to the message that we find in the New Testament today.
Yeah, I would agree. Very good. I want to get one more quick section in here before we close. We have a few minutes. Someone read for us 1 Kings chapter 19, verses 15 through 18, please.
The Lord said to him, "Go back the way you came and go to the desert of Damascus. When you get there, anoint Hazael king over Aram. Also anoint Jehu son of Nimshi king over Israel. And anoint Elisha son of Shaphat, help me if you can, from Abel
Okay. I never worry about pronunciation. Even when we say this is the right way to pronounce it, it's probably not the way they pronounce it anyway. So as long as we know who we're talking about, we'll be all right. So again, instead of letting Elijah just die here, as Elijah's kind of been requesting this whole time, God's given Elijah some work to do. It's like, we have work to do still, Elijah. You're not useless. It's not like there's nothing you can do here. I've got some tasks for you to perform. And he gives 3 very important tasks that he assigns to Elijah. First, he says to anoint Hazael king over Aram. Now, a little bit about Aram. It's going to come up quite a bit from here on out. Aram is the country north, or the kingdom north of Israel. It's kind of like modern-day Syria. That's the area we're talking about. A very powerful nation. And they will be fighting with the northern kingdom of Israel pretty much throughout this time period that we'll be studying in the study. Now, during this time, Ben-Hadad is currently the king of Aram, and he's going to be fighting with Israel a lot. We're going to see his name come up several times. Again, they're going to be the main enemy for Israel at this time, and we assume that Elijah does this. We do not see this instance recorded now. So I don't have any doubts that he did go ahead and do this, but we don't see it recorded. But we do have an encounter between Hazael and Elisha, which we'll talk about in more depth later. But in 2 Kings chapter 8, specifically in verse 13, Elisha confirms that Hazael is going to be king of Aram. Now, he doesn't anoint him, at least not in that section. So I assume that happened during Elijah's time. We're just not told that instance in any detail, but I don't have any doubt that that did happen. So that's who he is. Jehu, the second task is to anoint Jehu king of Israel. Again, this is the northern kingdom of Israel, the one that Ahab's currently in charge of. Now, this is Jehu, son of Nishmi, not to be confused with the prophet Jehu, who's the son of Hanani, who's mentioned earlier in 1 Kings chapter 16. Different person, Jehu, common name. Don't want to get confused about who our Jehu is. Now, we don't have any record of Elijah doing this. It doesn't say later, like he went and did it. And he may have. It's not really clear. But we have another instance between Elisha and him. Actually, Elijah does that as proxy. Elisha sends a prophet of a company of prophets to Jehu to anoint him on his behalf. Now, I don't know if he does that to confirm again that he is going to be king, or if this is the first time that he's being anointed. It almost sounds like this is the first time. So maybe Elijah had to pass his task down to Elisha. It's not clear, but that does happen. It does get done eventually. The third task that is assigned to Elijah is to anoint Elisha as prophet to succeed him, basically. And we're going to see Elisha is very much going to be a very mighty successor to Elijah's work. In fact, we're going to be out of time here, but pretty much right after this is going to be the story of Elisha coming into the picture. So not too worried about that. We're going to get to that next week probably. This happens at the end of 1 Kings chapter 19. And this also shows that God knows that Elijah is not going to be around forever. He can't always depend on him. There's going to be other people who can pick up this work. And sometimes that's a lesson for us as we think, when I'm not around or if I'm gone, there'll not be anybody to do the work that I do. But there's always this opportunity to teach and to pass on the work. And I don't know if that's exactly the lesson we're supposed to get out of this instance, but that is certainly an occurrence of this. So God's explanation is fairly straightforward for all these tasks. Hazael is basically going to be the main kind of sifter of the wicked in Israel, if you will. That's to put it nicely. Kind of referencing back to Elisha's encounter with him in 2 Kings chapter 8. Elisha weeps during his encounter with Hazael because he knows that Hazael is going to do terrible things to the people of Israel. He's very graphic about it. We'll get to it when we get to 2 Kings. I won't get too much into it now. But basically, those that aren't killed by the sword of Hazael, Jehu's going to take care of, and that's going to include the household of Ahab, spoilers. And then those that are not killed by him, Elisha's going to take care of. And we're going to see a lot of that later on in 2 Kings. So a lot of what God is saying here really is going to take place in the next book, in 2 Kings specifically. So not really much of a difference during Elijah's lifetime, but Elijah is kind of setting the foundation work for the things that are going to occur when he's no longer around. Finally, God kind of reveals to Elijah that there's still 7,000 in Israel that have not bowed their knee to Baal, kind of giving him some reassurance that not all is lost. There still is a faction of Israelites who are not going after the Baals, not going after idols. Now, this this is a small number. 7,000 in probably a population of a few million is not that significant. But then, we also think, since we just had the study about Abraham, think to the story of the destruction of Sodom. God said he would spare the city of Sodom, which was a great and powerful city in that time. He would spare it for the sake of 10 righteous people. There were not even 10 righteous people in that city. And of course, we argued you might max out at 6, but probably only 1 if you really think about it. Even that range, it doesn't hit that 10 mark. So 7,000 is probably a better percentage or a better group than literally almost nobody in an entirely great and powerful city. So just kind of an interesting comparison there. So we're gonna stop there. We're way out of time, but I wanted to finish that section because it's important to know kind of who these people are, where they're going to be fitting in later on in the annals of the kings, if you will. So we'll get to the end of chapter 19. We'll start in verse 19 next week. We talk about the call of Elisha, and then we'll probably start going through chapter 20 next week also. So if you want to read ahead, go ahead and start reading chapter 20 because we'll definitely start it next week. All right. Thank you.